Good morning, Big Spring Middle School. Today, in remembrance of September 11th, 2001, we have a special segment where teachers shared with you their memories from the morning of September 11th.
So 9/11, where was I? I was actually learning to be a teacher. I was doing my student teaching at a local elementary school. I was teaching 5th grade, and I remember one of the aides to the classroom coming in and telling me what was going on. But really nobody knew what was going on at the time, and then as we started to figure things out, more reports came in. I just remember that feeling of hopelessness, helplessness. What do you do? We got through our day, we went home, we watched the news, sort of figured out what was going on, and tried to regroup then as a country. So that's my remembrance of 9/11.
So my memory is of getting out of class and going to the Union Building at Dickinson and watching on all the TVs. The first tower was on fire, and then we saw the plane hit the second tower, and we all just stood in silence for hours. No one moved, no one even talked, and we were completely in shock that something would happen. It was unbelievable.
For 9/11, I was teaching a 4th grade classroom, and the secretary came to the door of my classroom and said, "I need to talk to you." So I went out in the hall, and I was the head teacher at the time of the building, and she said, "I don't think we should say anything to the students. This is very upsetting." And then at lunchtime, all the teachers went into the teacher lunchroom, and we were able to watch some of the footage. I think that day everybody was in shock, couldn't really talk much about it, but the following day was very somber, very quiet in my classroom. It was a very scary time.
So on 9/11, I was at the Ronald McDonald House. My daughter was in the hospital, and I was in Rochester, New York. The rest of my kids were at home, and they were worried because they knew that my husband and I were in New York, but they didn't realize that we were in Rochester. We weren't in New York City.
All right, hi Big Spring Middle School. It's Mrs. Beatty, and I'm here to talk about where I was on September 11th, 2001. And as it turns out, I was in the same place where I am now, teaching 6th grade at Big Spring Middle School. And at that time, Big Spring Middle School was in Mount Rock Elementary School. I remember that it was around specials time for the 6th graders, and so nobody was in my classroom at that time. And we had TVs in the one corner of the room, and the TV just came on. I was planning. The TV just came on, and there was these news flashes that were playing, and you just could not believe what you saw happening in New York, and it was in New York at that time. And that was just unbelievable, and it was so surreal to see that. Anyway, I remember going downstairs to the middle school office, and everybody was just questioning what is happening, what's going on, did you hear what happened? But I don't want to take too much time, but that's where I was when I first heard the news of September 11th, 2011. And it's very hard to talk about for those of us who were around to remember.
Hi, I'm Miss Stewart. I'm Miss Moran, and we wanted to tell you where we were on 9/11. I'll go first. So on 9/11, I actually worked for a company called Morgan Stanley in New York City. And I worked on a trading floor, and when the planes hit the towers, we had screens all over. And, we were evacuated from the building. It was a very tough day, but we were very, very proud of New York City for recovering and moving forward. But I couldn't get home that day. I actually had to stay at a friend's house. And many, many people had family members, and I'm getting a little choked up here, who died from our company. So it was a day in history that I will never forget, and we need to learn, to live together peacefully and move forward.
Yeah, I was in first grade. I do remember. I know I was a little itty bitty, and I remember they let us out from school early because we lived near a big city. I lived near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I remember my aunt worked right down the street from the World Trade Center, and we hadn't heard from her for a couple days, so it was very scary, not knowing whether she was still around, what happened to her, if she was in a hospital, anything like that. So very scary thing that happened, but I think we as a country learned a lot from it, and just like Ms. Stewart said, New York as a whole did a wonderful job coming together, and it's just proof that we can live together no matter what and work together and respect each other.
Yep. Stay strong.
On September 11th, I was in school and my class was in the library, and that is where we first heard news of the attacks. For us, being a school 20 miles south of Washington, D.C., the news of the Pentagon attack was what hit home most. A lot of the students were worried about family members. A lot of them worked in the Pentagon. And parents worried about their children started swarming the school and taking their kids home. We did stay in school for the majority of the day. So it was very, very scary not knowing what was going on and being so close to one of the attacks. On a personal note, I did discover later on that a high school classmate of mine, Patty Dillaber, who worked at the Pentagon, was killed in that attack. She had a 3-year-old daughter who was at the daycare, and luckily she survived. So every September 11th, I'm always a little emotional, remembering somebody that I went to school with who actually died in the attack, and thinking about all the other victims and family members.
When 9/11 happened, I was working at Mechanicsburg High School Library. They made an announcement on the intercom that a plane had hit the towers. And so people turned on the TVs in the rooms. I went to the principal's office to watch because he had a TV. And we were just really astounded and mentally asking, was it pilot error? Was there something wrong with the plane? And then not long after that, the second one hit just right in front of us, and we knew it was not an accident. It was really quiet the rest of the day. Everybody was watching TV, which we would probably not do nowadays. And one of my favorite students came to stay in the library because her aunt was in one of the towers and she was very worried. My family and I lived not far from TMI, the nuclear reactor, and they immediately had these seriously armed guards like you do not see here in the United States. You can go to Spain and see these armed guards, but it's really weird to see them guarding in the United States. The fighter planes were flying a lot. We were not far from Harrisburg International Airport either. And so there was this sound as they flew over the house, and to this day I can still pick out that sound of the fighter planes when they're flying even way up in the clouds. It's just a real specific sound. And they would fly over our house, big roary noise. And my daughter was only 4 at the time, and she was worried because after hearing the news and then hearing these planes, she was asking, are these planes going to hit the house? Before that, I thought flying was very enjoyable. Now it's a little bit more stressful because you ask what's going to happen. You've got all this extra security you have to go through, so it's definitely had repercussions even today. But the one positive moment that occurred was all the civility that people showed afterward. Strangers, neighbors, friends were just good to each other. They took care of each other. They went out of their way to really help each other. And so, without bringing in another disaster, I would love for us to return to that civility.
Hi, my name's Miss Demore, and on 9/11/2001, I was driving to a job interview in Pittsburgh, and I did not have my radio on or anything. I was just driving. It was early in the morning, and I turned on my radio, and I heard that some buildings were hit by a plane in New York City, and I thought, is this for real? Like, I couldn't believe it because I thought, this is so unusual. And I kept listening to the news reports, and I thought, oh my gosh, it is for real. And then, so as the day unfolded, I was really listening closely to my radio and checking in with other people, but it was very interesting for me. My first reaction was I couldn't believe it because something like that had never happened, and it was just so out of the ordinary. Thank you.
Okay, well, what's significant for my story is that I am from New York, and I'm from Long Island, New York. I grew up about 40 minutes outside of New York City. And the events that happened on 9/11 very strongly affected me, affected my family, and affected many people that I know. On September 11th, I was a junior in college at Westchester University, and it was about, I want to say 9 o'clock in the morning, and I was in the middle of violin class, of all things. And I'm sitting there in class and playing my violin, and this girl burst into the room and said, I need to speak to Matt Tiffany. And I was like, okay, I have no idea what this is all about. Went out into the hallway, and she said, you're from New York, right? And I said, absolutely. She said, somebody flew some planes into the World Trade Center. And immediately I just started thinking about Jamie and Tony, two of my cousins. Jamie he works in finances, and he worked in one of the buildings. My cousin Tony is a construction worker that often does projects or did projects in the World Trade Center towers. And so and I knew other people as well that worked in the building. A friend of mine, Kurt, worked in the building as well. And so I was just very terrified. I ran back to my dorm room, and I sat in my dorm room, just turned on the TV, and just sat there in absolute horror and awe, and just as I'm watching these events unfold and seeing the smoke pouring out of the towers, and nobody knew what was going on, and I immediately pulled my phone out of my pocket and tried to call my family, and I guess millions of people all around the world were trying to call New York, and so I could not get through. And I sat there, and I didn't even realize that I was crying. I just sat there watching the TV, couldn't believe this was happening, not knowing if the people I knew were dead or alive, and my door was open, and several of the men that lived on my floor, I lived on an all-men's floor, saw me and asked if everything was okay, and I told them the situation, and the next thing I knew, I was in my room with about 15 other people, all with their cell phones out, all just calling my parents' number, somebody trying to get through. It took 4 hours before I finally got a yes or a no if everybody was okay, and those were 4 of the scariest hours of my life. It turned out that my cousin Tony was not working in the building that day. It turned out that Jamie made it out safe. I didn't know what floor he worked on. The planes hit above the 80th floor, and he worked on the 40th floor, so he was able to make it out safe. Unfortunately, my friend Kurt, who I was in a band with, he worked on I think the 96th or 97th floor of the first building hit, and he did not make it out, unfortunately. So that was very tough on his family, and just knowing him and having worked with him so much, it was very difficult. In the aftermath, just finding out all of my friends that lost family members, the worst story I can remember is that one of my friends from high school, her father, uncle, and 2 brothers, I believe, all worked for the same fire company, and they worked for the fire company that was in the tower when it collapsed. So she lost all those men in her life in one instant. So it's one of the toughest stories I've ever heard. But one of the things that I remember very clearly in the aftermath of 9/11 is just the outpouring of support from all around the country, the love and concern and caring and everything that came out of that was headed towards New York. I mean, in that moment, 300 million Americans, every single person was a New Yorker or a DC native. Everybody, we were all Americans. I love the story that that day was virtually no crime in New York City for 2 weeks. There was no stealing, there was no murders, there was nothing of any kind going on because everybody was just completely into help their brother mode, help their sisters, help each other out. We were all brothers and sisters that day. And we were all Americans. I remember going home to visiting my family that Thanksgiving. It had already been a few months since the attacks, and every single house, every single one had an American flag flying proud in front of the house. And that just really affected me, and it really showed me that we truly are all Americans. And whenever I look back on this day and I think of this day, I just think of, I try not to just focus on the horrors that happened and all the many lives that were lost, but I try to focus on the few positive things that came out of the day, and that 300 million Americans stood tall as Americans and said, this is not going to stand. We are not going to allow this type of action to be done against our country ever again. We are America, we are strong, and you can't bring us down. And I always think about that when 9/11 comes around every year. Thank you very much.
So now it's my turn to share my memory of September 11th, 2001. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. I was actually living in Phoenix, Arizona, and the time difference was 2 hours there. So when things were happening here around like 8:30 in the morning, it was actually 6 in the morning there. So I had gotten up, I was driving to work, and I was listening to the radio. And as I'm listening, I turned it up and I kept thinking that it was like a hoax. It actually reminded me of the Orson Welles War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and I couldn't tell if it was real. And as I was listening, the radio DJ got loud and crazy, and they were talking about the second plane had just hit the building. So I remember them just yelling and saying, "Oh my gosh, a second plane," and you know, nobody knowing what was happening. So I got to school and I ran into my classroom, and there was another teacher there, and we sat down together, and the TV was already on, and we were just watching all of this happen. And my family, being on the East Coast, obviously I was really nervous. I can't remember at what point I called my mom. Honestly, the most vivid moment for me was when the airplane went down here in Western Pennsylvania, because, you know, New York was close to my family, Washington was close to my family, but when things started happening in Pennsylvania is when I really started to panic. So I think it was at that point, that I started crying, and then that I actually, I think, called my mom and was like, "What is happening?" So it was a rough day, being, you know, 3,000 miles away and not knowing, you know, what all was happening here on the East Coast. So thank you for letting us share our memories with you today. And I hope it helped you to really kind of understand what those of us that lived this history were feeling and experiencing on September 11th.